In September of 1908, a train left New York City carrying 137 children. Only 129 arrived at the documented destination. 8 children simply ceased to exist in the public record. That's not a clerical error. That's not a transcription mistake made by some overworked administrator. 8 children vanished from official documentation between boarding and arrival, and for over a century, nobody in the historical mainstream thought that was worth examining seriously. 8 children, gone from paper, gone from census records, gone from the follow-up visits that the Children's Aid Society itself mandated as policy. The orphan trains are one of those chapters of American history that gets taught with a particular warmth.
Children
Necessary,
relocated,
redemptive, bittersweet. Between 1854 and 1929, roughly 250,000 children were relocated from the crowded streets of New York and other eastern cities to rural families across the Midwest, the South, and the Plains. The progressive era's great humanitarian experiment. Children given a second chance. Farms given extra hands. Two needs meeting somewhere in Ohio or Kansas or Nebraska. But there was one train that operated differently. One specific journey in the autumn of 1908 that left behind a paper trail so strange, so full of contradictions, that it reads less like a welfare program and more like something else entirely. Something I'm still not entirely sure how to name. This is the story of Train 4C, the last orphan train to carry children classified in private institutional correspondence as oversized specimens. That phrase alone should stop you cold. Stopped me. The official story goes like this, and I want to be fair to that narrative before I start pulling at its threads.
Here is the voucher
The Children's
for the
Aid
bread.
Society, founded by Charles Loring Brace in
Ensure you
1853,
report to the
had been
agency
operating
by
placement trains for more than
Thursday
50
for your
years by
next
1908.
appointment.
The program was genuinely progressive for its time. Children who would otherwise face poorhouses, street crime, or early death were matched with farming families who needed labor but also, in many cases, genuinely wanted to raise a child. Brace's vision was sentimental and paternalistic by modern standards, but it wasn't sinister on its face. The society kept records. They sent agents to follow up. They had a system. Train 4C, according to official documentation filed with the New York Department of Charities, departed Grand Central Terminal on September 14, 1908, bound for Callaway County in Missouri. The children aboard were between the ages of 7 and 14. They had been collected from 3 separate institutions: the Newsboys Lodging House, St. Vincent's Home for Children, and a lesser-known facility called the Harborview Receiving Station, which had only been operating since 1906. The escort on record was a man named Edmund Pruitt, listed as a field agent for the Children's Aid Society. His assistant was recorded only as Miss L. Vance. The train made 2 stops,
That's what the
one in
narrative
Pittsburgh,
says.
one in Indianapolis,
Timing
before arriving in Missouri.
appears standard.
At least that's what the official filing says. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers on this particular journey are where everything begins to unravel. The intake manifest from Harborview Receiving Station, which I found while researching something else entirely. I was actually tracking progressive-era institutional funding patterns, lists 43 children transferred to the custody of Children's Aid Society agents on September 12, 1908, 2 days before the departure. Standard procedure allowed for up to 72 hours between institutional transfer and train departure. Fine, normal. But the Harborview Intake Manifest uses a column that doesn't appear on any other children's aid document I've examined from this period. It's labeled simply P-Class. Next to 31 of those 43 children's names, someone has marked a small notation, P1 or P2. The remaining 12 children have no notation at all. I showed this document to 2 archivists. Neither could tell me what P-Class meant. There's no corresponding glossary, no internal memorandum explaining the classification system. It appears in this one manifest and nowhere else in the public archive. Speaking of classification systems, the physical descriptions recorded for the Harborview children are statistically unusual. I want to be precise here. The average height recorded for boys aged 10 to 12 in 1908 American institutional records is approximately 54 inches. Among the Harborview children in that age range on this manifest, the average recorded height is 61 inches. That's 7 inches above the documented mean. One boy, listed as age 9, is recorded at 64 inches tall. That's 5'4", 9 years old. The timeline isn't subtle once you start measuring it. Which brings me to Edmund Pruitt himself. Because Edmund Pruitt, the listed escort, has an interesting history that the official narrative doesn't fully account for. Before his documented employment with the Children's Aid Society, Pruitt worked for 3 years at something called the Intercoastal Medical Survey Bureau, a private organization funded through a combination of philanthropic trusts and what appear to be federal contracts, though the specific agency contracting with them is redacted in every document I've located. The Bureau's stated purpose was conducting baseline physiological surveys of rural and immigrant populations. Let me be fair to the official narrative here. Medical surveying was a common progressive era practice. Eugenicists, public health advocates, anthropologists, all of them were measuring bodies during this period. It was a dark chapter, but a widespread one. Pruitt having that background doesn't automatically make him sinister. But here's what matters. The Intercoastal Medical Survey Bureau closed its operations in August of 1908, 1 month before Train 4C departed. And Edmund Pruitt's employment with the Children's Aid Society began in September of 1908, the very month of the journey. There is no record of him before or after in any Children's Aid document. He exists in their records for exactly 6 weeks. The timing is almost theatrical. Now, where did Train 4C actually go? Let's follow the physical route because the route itself is strange. Grand Central to Pittsburgh is a standard corridor. Pittsburgh to Indianapolis is conventional. But the documented final leg, Indianapolis to Callaway County, Missouri, would typically route through St. Louis. Standard rail geography.
Documented
the Missouri
final
Pacific
leg,
line made
Indianapolis
that
to Callaway County, Missouri,
according to the railroad
routing
departure
through
log
St.
from
Louis,
the Indiana State
Standard
Historical Society,
Missouri
did
Pacific.
not take the Missouri Pacific connection at Indianapolis. It departed the Indianapolis yard on a spur line operated by a private freight carrier called the Whitmore Agricultural Transport Company. This wasn't a passenger line. The Whitmore Company moved grain and livestock equipment. They had no documented contract with the Children's Aid Society. Their spur ran south and west, not toward Callaway County, Missouri, but toward the confluence of the Wabash and Ohio rivers, in a region that in 1908 was sparsely populated and largely outside regular census enumeration. And here's where the 8 missing children become impossible to dismiss. The receiving family records from Callaway County document 129 children arriving. 129. The departure manifest from New York lists 137. Between Indianapolis and Missouri, 8 children departed the documented record and never returned to it. No death certificates. No return child records, which the society maintained when placements failed. No court records indicating guardianship disputes. No letters, no photographs, nothing. I spent 14 months trying to find those 8 children. I found one, a boy named James Coyne, listed at age 11 on the Harborview Manifest. Appeared in the 1910 census not in Missouri, but in a small unincorporated township in southern Illinois.
No death certificates.
He's listed as a laborer in the household of a man named August Welch, whose occupation is recorded as
letters,
agricultural experimental station
nothing.
keeper. James Coyne's census entry has one anomaly.
Absence.
His height is listed. Census records don't typically record height. Someone added it manually in different ink. He was recorded at 67 inches, 5'7", 13 years old. August Welch, I later discovered, had received a federal land use dispensation in 1907 through the Department of Agriculture's Office of Experimental Stations. The dispensation granted him rights to operate an experimental growing facility on 340 acres of southern Illinois bottomland. What exactly was being grown or cultivated on those 340 acres, the records don't say. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist, but let me keep laying them out. The Harborview Receiving Station, the third institution from which children were drawn for Train 4C, was the only point of origin that I cannot fully document. The Newsboys Lodging House has deep records. St. Vincent's has records. Harborview opened in 1906 and closed in 1909. 3 years of operation. No founding charter is publicly available. The address on file, 1140 West Street, Manhattan, corresponds to a building that was demolished in 1911, and I cannot find a single photograph of it or a former employee who ever gave an interview or wrote a memoir. For a facility that housed children during the Progressive Era, when reformers were obsessively documenting everything, Harborview Receiving Station is completely invisible. Except for one thing. In a 1907 letter from the philanthropist Eleanor Gould to her nephew, held at the New York Historical Society and accessible only because Eleanor Gould was notable for entirely unrelated reasons, she mentions attending a reception at which she met the director of what she calls the Harbor Station on West Street, a peculiar establishment very quietly funded, where they seem terribly interested in the children's physical development. Terribly interested in the children's physical development. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Because the question that the official narrative never raises, never even approaches, is why. Why would a legitimate child welfare operation route a train through a private freight carrier with no passenger contract? Why would those specific children, documented as significantly larger than average for their ages, be classified with an unexplained system? Why does one documented child appear in a census 4 states away from his placement destination, in the household of a federally funded agricultural experimenter?
Here.
Maybe there was a mundane logistical reason for the freight route.
In
Maybe P-class referred to something entirely prosaic,
we must
some
account
internal
for
shorthand that's
every
been lost.
missing structure.
Maybe James Coyne ran away from his Missouri placement and ended up in Illinois by chance. And maybe someone with a quirky habit recorded his height for no meaningful reason. Maybe. But here's where the pattern synthesis becomes genuinely difficult to dismiss.
Harbor Station
because Train 4C doesn't
West
exist in
Street.
isolation. It exists in a specific
Peculiar
historical context.
establishment.
In 1908, the United
Very
States was at the early
quietly
edges of a period when
funded.
pituitary research, the gland responsible for human growth, was undergoing rapid transformation. Pierre Marie's work on acromegaly, Harvey Cushing's emerging research, the broad interest in endocrine function that would explode in the following decade. The medical establishment was beginning to understand, for the very first time, that human growth was hormonally regulated. That children who grew unusually large weren't simply well-fed. They had something measurably different happening inside their bodies.
Official
And in
narrative
1908,
never
there was no
raises.
ethical framework
Why?
governing the study of that
Routing
difference.
through private
None whatsoever.
freight.
The children on Train
Classified
4C,
children,
or at least the Harborview
placement
cohort, weren't just
elsewhere.
large. They were consistently,
Mundane
statistically,
logistical
improbably
reasons.
large.
Maybe
And they were
prosaic
institutional children,
explanations.
orphans, wards
Maybe
of the state in the most
coincidence.
precarious sense,
Plausible
children without parents who could
alternative
ask questions,
narratives offered.
children without advocates who had legal standing to demand answers. Speaking of advocacy, the Children's Aid Society's own follow-up records from 1909, the mandatory placement checks, don't include a single follow-up visit for any child whose name appears on the Harborview section of the 4C Manifest. Every other child from that train has a follow-up note, even brief ones. Child well-placed, appears healthy, family satisfied. Those notes exist for the St. Vincent's children. For the Newsboys Lodging House children, the Harborview children have no follow-up documentation, not even a note saying the visit couldn't be made. They were simply never followed up on. Which brings me to a final document. A letter dated November 3rd, 1908, 7 weeks after Train 4C's departure, from Edmund Pruitt to an unnamed recipient, a copy of which surfaced in a 2019 estate sale in Cincinnati and was briefly listed in an auction catalog before the lot was apparently withdrawn. I didn't purchase it. I've never held it. But the catalog description, which I did obtain, quotes the letter's opening line directly. It reads, "The specimens arrived in excellent condition, and the second cohort shows the same promising indicators as the first." The second cohort. Train 4C was not the first. That sentence means there was an earlier transfer. An earlier set of children classified the same way moved through the same channels or similar ones toward whatever destination Edmund Pruitt considered promising. There's a first cohort out there in the historical record or buried beneath
Please,
it,
sir,
and I haven't found them yet. I don't know if their
soon.
documentation was destroyed or simply never created
there
or
enough
sitting in a
food
private
for
collection
today?
somewhere waiting for someone to look
We
at it
haven't
with the
done
right kind of
anything
attention.
wrong.
Let me return to the human element here.
We
Because
have
it's easy
rights.
in the act of chasing
Why
documents and
won't
railroad logs
anyone
and census anomalies
advocate
to
for
forget
us?
that we're talking about children. Actual
Give
children.
us answers.
Whatever their institutional classification, whatever the strange notation next to their names on that manifest, they were kids who had already lost their families before any of this happened to them. They arrived at Harborview or some similar place because life had already taken everything from them. And then they boarded a train and stepped into the gap in the historical record. And no, James Coyne appears in the 1910 census. He disappears from it entirely by 1920. He would have been 23 in 1920, old enough to head his own household, old enough to serve in a war, old enough to make a mark in some record somewhere. He doesn't. I don't want to speculate about what that means, but I'm not going to pretend it doesn't trouble me. The broader question, the one that the Orphan Train program's warm legacy doesn't invite us to ask, is what happens when a welfare system and a research interest occupy the same institutional space. When the same social networks that fund housing for vulnerable children also fund physiological curiosity about those children. When the person escorting those children has a recent history working for an entity whose purpose was measuring bodies. The individual pieces are explainable. The cumulative pattern is something else. Maybe I'm wrong about all of it. Maybe Train 4C is exactly what the official paperwork claims. A routine placement journey with sloppy record keeping, a private rail connection made for boring logistical reasons, and 8 children who are simply lost to history through ordinary institutional neglect, which was genuinely common in 1908 and requires no dark explanation. Maybe Edmund Pruitt was a conscientious welfare worker who moved on to other employment we simply haven't traced. Maybe Harborview was unremarkable and its silence in the archive is just silence, not concealment. Maybe August Welch's experimental station grew corn or soybeans and James Coyne found his way there by the kind of random displacement that defined the lives of children without families in that era. Maybe. But here's what I keep returning to. The Children's Aid Society followed up on thousands of children. They followed up obsessively because their program depended on demonstrating successful outcomes to the philanthropists who funded it. They had every incentive to document success. They documented failure to return children, complaint letters, placement dissolutions. They documented nearly everything about nearly everyone. They documented nothing about the children from Harborview. Not a single follow-up, not a single outcome, not a single name that resurfaces in the way that normal children, even orphaned, displaced, marginalized children resurface. In census records, in marriage certificates, in death records, in city directories, in the small paper trail that human beings inevitably leave simply by continuing to exist. Those 31 children marked P-class on that autumn manifest left no trail. And that final image is the one I can't put down. 31 children, a September morning, a train platform in New York City. The platform crowded and noisy and full of the particular kind of organized chaos that attends large institutional movements. Someone handing out sandwiches, probably. Someone crying. Someone excited. 31 children who were, by every measure we can reconstruct, larger than they should have been for their ages, moving through a bureaucratic process designed to place them somewhere safe. Where were they really taken? I don't have an answer. I'm not sure the answer still exists in any accessible form. But the question itself, the very fact that it can be asked coherently with documented evidence about children who were supposed to be protected, feels like something that deserves to sit with you for a while. The orphan trains carry a lot of American myth. Redemption, reinvention, the belief that the country's institutions, however imperfect, were fundamentally reaching towards something decent. Train 4C is a hole in that myth, a clean, precise hole with specific dimensions. 8 names that disappear between Indianapolis and Missouri. 31 notations that have no explanation. One letter quoting a second cohort we haven't
Quickly
found
now,
yet.
everyone
The record
on the
ends.
platform.
The children don't reappear. And somewhere in southern Illinois, in a bottomland township that no longer appears on modern
Mind
maps,
the gap,
there were
children,
340
move
acres where something was being cultivated in 1908. Something the federal government thought worth funding and protecting and keeping quietly away from ordinary scrutiny. Whatever grew there, it left no harvest we can name.